Welcome to another Faithful Question session here from the empty Morris Hall. We are doing our best to deal with the difficulties of the pandemic, of course. We keep hoping someday that we will do these in person, but for now, we continue to be a live stream only event. But let's begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, you have blessed marriage and graced it with your special blessings and gifts, and make it a vehicle for love. Help us tonight as we reflect on how to make our marriages better, that it is from you that this was divinely ordained, and that through you we can make the most of our marriages. We ask this in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so tonight's topic: how can I improve my marriage? One of my more pragmatic sessions. There will be some theology tonight, but frankly, the emphasis will be on how to make that theology pragmatic and less about the theology of marriage, even though we will be covering it. Let's get into the overview. We will start with some caveats and conditions. This is one of those topics where you can get yourself into trouble if you don't properly lay out some foundational aspects. So I will do that to begin things. And then we're going to talk about the different ways that the church talks about what marriage is. The church talks about marriage as being sacramental. The church talks about marriage uniting the husband and the wife as one. The church talks about marriage being life permanent, and I'll explain what that means. Then we're going to have an intermission, and then after that we'll talk about marriage as a life of service, marriage as life-giving, and then some miscellaneous advice that isn't so much directly tied to the church, but I think is an appropriate extension. And since the goal here is to help us improve our marriages, there will be things in that are pretty pragmatic, and that can extend even beyond the specifically theological. Okay, so let's jump right in. As always, first topic on the agenda is to talk about how to ask questions. So the key ways you're going to use chatting features to do so. The best way is to do it through YouTube. This is being streamed on YouTube, and therefore we want to do it on YouTube. So what that means is you need to log in on YouTube. You can do it with any YouTube account or any Google account, so your Gmail account. A true Google account, and of course a direct YouTube account. All of those can log in on YouTube. So get logged in, and then go ahead and you can make a comment. If you don't have any Google account, you are a very small hole in the system, but nevertheless want to make sure that hole is covered. And so for you, what you would do is you would go to the website deaconken.org/blog/chat. And there we have a chat session open to anyone. So hopefully the Russian bots or the Chinese systems don't find out about it, because they could go in and cause all kinds of havoc. But anybody can make a comment there. If you can't get logged in on YouTube, go ahead and do that. Now, if you want to, so you can make any chat comments you want. We don't have a lot of it on these, and that's fine. But if you would like to ask a question of me, just so we can differentiate it from any generic comment, please start your comment with Deacon question in all capitals, followed by a dash, and then the question. And let's make sure that when you do that, you put it all in one comment. A week or two ago, somebody did that, and then they did a second comment, which was their the question. And the problem with that is if anyone commented in between or anything like that, it could get disconnected. So put it in one comment, Deacon question, all capitals, followed by the question. Caveats and conditions. So this is about the topic for the night itself. I want to make it clear that practical advice by its nature only applies in particular situations. So I'm going to suggest a number of things, And you might say, well, that doesn't apply to me. That's fine. I don't want to suggest that everything I suggest is appropriate for everyone. But to be able to give practical advice, I have to risk that. I have to risk giving some advice that is only applicable to a certain number of people. So if it's just not applicable to you, don't worry about it. It's not a good suggestion for you. Hopefully there are other ones that are. And they're most definitely not required or mandatory or immoral if you don't do it. Practical advice by nature always has conditions and caveats. The other thing I want to talk about is traditional Western gender roles, although I'm generally quite supportive of those. The church doesn't see them as absolutely mandatory. It can see them as that women being the primary breadwinner and things like that is acceptable. Now, there's a lot of good reasons for the traditional role, really centered around the idea that women actually have the babies, and therefore it is much easier for them to, particularly if they're having children every couple years or every 3 years, it's very difficult to get into a career and a flow. And so the traditional role of the husband being more the breadwinner and the mother being more staying home with the children has a lot of natural biological sense to it, but it is not required. Frankly, in my house right now, my wife is the breadwinner, and I'm focusing more on other things. So I just wanted to be clear, even though a lot of my advice will be ordered towards the traditional gender roles, and there's a lot of wisdom in those, again, most definitely not required, and there are definitely times where it makes sense for the opposite to be true. I'm also going to give advice specifically to people who aren't yet married. My hope is that this talk is not just applicable to people who already have 5-10 years under their belt, because to some degree, that means you may have already, if you don't have this wisdom, you may have been making mistakes for 5 to 10 years. And obviously, I'm not the only one with this wisdom, but I'm saying in general, if my goal is to help this wisdom out there, my hope would be that people who are not yet married would know this stuff as well. And so I have some advice specific for those of you who are not yet married. And I hope this talk as a whole will be both valuable to you, but also there'll be some specific advice just for you. However, there might be some people out there who've been married for 10 years, 20 years, and they think, oh, great, I didn't do any of that. Relax. It'll be fine. God works with you where you are. It'll be okay. So if you didn't do the premarital stuff, advice that I'm giving, it's okay. God will work with you where you are, and you move forward. And then finally, I want to point out that even though I will be giving a lot of personal examples, things I've done right, I'm sure there'll be a few moments, I'm not going to talk as much about things I've done wrong, because the problem in that space is, to some degree, I'm violating the confidence of my marriage. When I've made a major mistake that's really let my wife down, shouting that to the wind is a little unfair to her. It's a little unfair to me. And obviously, the inverse is even worse. Times that she's made significant mistakes, it's not fair to her to spread those to the wind. So even though I tend to be a fairly open person about these things, it is important that I am respectful of my wife. And so I won't be using a ton of very particular examples, except in the positive. And that can give the impression that I'm thinking I have the world's most perfect, wonderful marriage. No, I have a normal marriage. We try our best to do a very good job, but we have our weaknesses and failures and mistakes. And I don't at all want this to suggest I know how to do everything, and if you just did it like me, you'd be perfect. In fact, there are a number of things that I wrote down as practical suggestions that in writing them down, I said to myself, I need to do a better job at that. I was very willing to put down suggestions. There were even suggestions for me. So please, do not think I'm coming at this from an arrogant place. Actually, that I hope that it comes from a place of humility, and that's what I believe. Okay, let's jump into the different things for marriage. So again, there's a whole different list of things. We're going to start with marriage is sacramental. First, we want to start by defining what a sacrament is. This comes from the Catechism. Going to be a fair number of Catechism quotes tonight. Hopefully they don't get too burdensome. The seven sacraments are the signs and instruments by which the Holy Spirit spreads the grace of Christ, the head, throughout the church, which is his body. The sacraments are perceptible signs, words, and actions accessible to our human nature. By the action of Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit, they make present, efficacious the grace that they signify. Another way to say this is sacraments take regular activities and make them vehicles for God to give us grace. So, all the time we pour water on ourselves, a shower, washing our hands, what have you. But when we pour water on someone as a baptism, it becomes a vehicle for grace. All the seven sacraments are that way. So the same goes for marriage. There is such a thing as a natural marriage, a marriage that is not sacramental. That would be every marriage that isn't between two Christians. That is a natural marriage, and that's not to be derogatory toward it, it's just to state the reality. Sacramental marriage is to take that regular, normal thing and infuse it with some extra graces. And so through the act of matrimony, or through the sacrament of matrimony, we're able to receive extra graces from God to help us. So, an important caveat to that, of course, is that this means marriage transcends Christianity. It exists in all cultures pretty much, and it doesn't require any religious convictions to make sense. So that is real and exists and is important, and the church honors that as a good and wonderful thing. Sacramental marriage, as I said, is yet another step beyond that. So let's continue on with sacramental theology specific to marriage. By reason of their state in life and their order, Christian spouses have their own special gifts in the people of God. In other words, God's grace married people. The grace proper to the sacrament of matrimony is intended to perfect the couple's love and to strengthen the indissolubility of their indissoluble unity. By this grace, they help one another to attain holiness in their married life and in welcoming and educating their children. So, just like I said, that these are normal things, and the grace of the sacraments strengthen, perfect, help. As we do those things, we get grace from God. Christ dwells with them, gives them their strength to take up their crosses and so follow him, and to rise again after they have fallen, to forgive one another, to bear one another's burdens, to be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ, and to love one another with supernatural, tender, and fruitful love. Same kind of point. So, what's hiding in all of these words is the idea that marriage is a covenant, that it is a covenant between three people, man, woman, and God, and that marriage is a way for God to give us grace. Marriage is a way for God to give us purpose. And interestingly, in a natural marriage, even though the people doing it may not specifically know that they are doing something that God enjoys and likes, these things still have some amount of truth. It may not be sacramental, it may be natural, but those natural things, people get purpose through marriage. And it doesn't matter whether it's sacramental or not in that instance. Now, obviously, to receive special graces from God in the sacramental sense, it has to be sacramental. But again, on similar lines, God can give grace to whomever he wants at whatever time he wants. And so he can give it to people who have natural marriages as well to help them with their natural marriages. But the key words were perfect, help, strengthen. The sacramental marriage takes it hopefully to another level. Okay, that's great theology. Thanks, Dink and Ken. How does that help me with my husband, my wife today? So let's talk about some practical things we can do to make the most of our sacramental marriages. First, pray together. Praying is a way we unite ourselves to God, and when we do it with other people, we through the graces of that uniting with God, unite ourselves to that other person. And so, since we're supposed to be so close to our spouse, praying with them is really, really important and brings us together closer. And here's some specific things I would suggest that you consider praying for. Pray for to understand the graces that God gives you through marriage. Pray in thanksgiving for the graces of your marriage. And pray to discern any particular purpose that your particular marriage may have. Not only marriage has a generic purpose, but then individual purpose may change, right? There are certain families where a ton of the children end up becoming clergy or religious. I think that couple was given a specific gift and responsibility to have those children who ended up with those roles. You look at a family like the Kennedys, right? And we can talk about whether everything they did was good or bad, but they seem to have taken on this mantle that they had to give back from their wealth in a political sense and a life of service. And for the most part, they did that, at least through the John and Robert Kennedy generation. So each marriage may have results that would be particular to your marriage that God has graced you with. So I think that's a wonderful thing to pray about. And once you've come to kind of discern that, no, God has given our marriage a very specific purpose or an additional purpose beyond the generic, write it down. Recognize that you've identified it, and then put it on paper, put it on the wall, put it in your journal, whatever, and then make sure it is part of your prayer life and your active plans with your spouse to deliver on that both responsibility and gift that a purpose gives you.
Deacon question.
Okay, go ahead.
Are you referring to Christian marriage? Is this referring to any Christian? Will you differentiate between Catholic and other?
Very good. So the question is, is there a difference between Christian marriage, which would include Orthodox and Protestants and Catholics, or is it just Catholic sacramental? And no, the Catholic Church believes that the sacraments are available to all Christians. Now, the particulars that might be available to them differ, but in the general sense, sacraments are available. And so marriage is one of the sacraments that all Christians can participate in. So it doesn't matter if you are Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, everyone can receive these graces. Everyone can have a sacramental marriage. So yes, when I talk about marriage here, I'm talking about Christian marriage transcending. When I talk about sacramental marriage, I mean Christian sacramental, and that transcends just the Catholic Church. Great question. Okay, continue on what we should be praying about. So you pray with your spouse. That's really important. That's really wonderful. Next step is when you're having your private prayer time, pray for them and specifically for their needs. Not just it's normal for us to focus on our own needs. But one of the things that's really important in marriage is that each of your needs and desires becomes the other person's needs and desires. And one of the wonderful ways to make sure that happens is to use a portion of your prayer time to pray for your spouse's needs and desires, even if they might be somewhat counter to your own, right? So there could be things going on that you're like, well, my spouse really wants that. I'm not even sure if I want that. But if you pray, God, help us to know whether this is the right thing to do. Make sure that my spouse is given the graces that she desires or he desires. I'm generally going to speak a spouse in the she because I'm a he. And if it is your will, please give this to my wife, husband, what have you. Okay. So make sure you do that. Another one, if you're a couple that's been married for a while particularly, and you've kind of moved from being just a regular secular natural marriage, and imbued your marriage with more religious meaning over time, you might want to consider doing a renewal of vows ceremony. It's not going to, if your marriage is sacramental, a renewal of vows does not change that. But it can give it additional, it can be good for you to really make concrete this better understanding that you now have of its sacramentalness. So renewing of vows does not make it sacramental. It either is or is not sacramental, but renewing of vows may be a way between the two of you to remind yourself something maybe that you weren't so sure of when you got married, and something to consider doing it. This may not be the best advice in the middle of the pandemic. I think you'll get a little bit of a chuckle from the staff if you ask for renewal of vows right now. We're having a hard enough time marrying people getting married for the first time. But so hopefully this is advice for 6 months, for a year from now, something like that. And then finally, in your home, display the religious aspects of your wedding. And this is actually something I have more frustration with us younger couples, which would be my generation and younger. For those of you who are young, I know I'm not so young anymore, but I feel young. But starting around my generation, if you look at the pictures people have up on the walls of their homes for their marriage, they're the pictures that they took after the wedding, generally before the reception. The norm these days is you have the ceremony, you have some pictures in the church, you then go somewhere beautiful to take your beautiful pictures, and then you show up at the reception, perhaps having tested the patience of your guests by having made them wait while you took those pictures. In fact, you're seeing longer and longer delays these days between the ceremony and the reception so that those things can happen. In any case, those are the pictures that end up on people's walls in the framed picture. It's the one at the rose garden or the lake or wherever they decided to take them. Put up the picture from the church. Put up the one that says this was not just a wedding on a lake, that this was a wedding in a church. Put that picture on the wall. If you gave each other a Bible or something at marriage, display that. Do what you can to, in your home, emphasize that your marriage has a sacramental nature and emphasize that. And I think pictures is obviously a great place to start, but if you have other mementos or things that come from that, you can use those too. Before marriage advice. And this might be one of the toughest ones for you not yet married people to accept because society has been telling you a lie as you've been getting older, or as you've been raised. And that is, it doesn't matter who you marry. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but absolutely it matters. You should try to marry a Catholic. Let me read from the Catechism. Difference of confession between the spouses does not constitute an insurmountable obstacle for marriage. Difference of confession means a Protestant marrying a Catholic or an Orthodox marrying a Protestant or anything like that. That's called a difference of confession. But the difficulties of mixed marriages must not be underestimated. Disparity of cult, this goes further, this is between a Christian and a non-Christian, can further aggravate these difficulties. Differences about faith and the very notion of marriage, but also different religious mentalities can become source of tension in a marriage, especially in regards to the education of children. So the church is saying that these are real problems, but they're not necessarily insurmountable. And if you're already married, I think you want to emphasize not insurmountable. But if you're not yet married, my fear is that it's not insurmountable will make you think it doesn't matter. Why would you want to go into a marriage with a known set of problems that are a time bomb waiting to explode down the road as your children get older and as other things in life start to develop? Yes, you can marry a non-Catholic, and I'm not saying you should never never should be done. But I am saying your priority list of who you're looking for should include somebody who shares your faith. And just so it's clear that this is not just a Catholic thing, I would say the same thing to a Jew or a Muslim or a Buddhist. Sharing your faith is so important. If you are going to be truly united, how can you be united when one of the most fundamental things about you, your religious convictions, aren't shared with your spouse? The unfortunate thing that happened here is, if you go back a couple hundred years, you were supposed to marry somebody of the same religion, you were supposed to marry somebody of the same race, you were supposed to marry somebody of the same culture, some of the same economic status. There's this big list of things of here's who you were supposed to marry. And in the 20th century, we rightly started examining whether these made sense. Was it appropriate that we said you should marry somebody of the same race? And we said, yes, you should be able to marry somebody of a different race. There's no reason for that to be. That's just bigotry. Unfortunately, as we did those appropriate revisions to look at, no, these guidelines are poorly conceived, some of the good got thrown out with the bad. And a particular good one is the importance of having a religion in common. I would also say the same to somebody who just is, I'll call it like a very loose Catholic, right? Somebody who doesn't want a strong faith. And of course that disappoints me, but they should be marrying someone who's kind of the same way. You get a lukewarm Catholic who doesn't really want their faith and is going to be frustrated by marrying a Catholic who's serious about faith. That's a bad match. Having a marriage where you are of a similar mind is really, really important. So if you want to be serious about your faith in your life in general, then you need to marry somebody who's just going to be the same mindset as a Catholic. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news. If you are curious about this, you're struggling with this, feel free to contact me. Email me at ken@deaconken.org. I'll do my best to explain the nature of things as I understand them and make sure it's done in a way that is, respectful of your current situation and all of that. I know this is tough advice for some people to hear. And again, for those of you who are already married, God has done his best to bless your union. I don't want to stand in the way with that. I want to make it clear that, yes, these problems are not insurmountable. So I'm not saying leave your spouse if you don't do this. However, if you're not yet married, this should be high on your priority list. And yes, we don't get everything on our priority list when we get married, but this should be towards the top. Next advice: embrace that marriage is a godly union. If you want to have a serious Catholic marriage, you need to do that. Make sure your spouse feels the same way. And a way to help figure that out is to start praying with each other before you're married, probably even before you're engaged. Figure out that, no, we like to pray together. It works. It makes sense. Or if you have one person who wants to pray a lot and the other person's like, do we have to do this? That should be a little bit of a sign that their feelings about marriage are not the same. So, I'm not talking about on your first date. Maybe you can get 3 or 4 in before you start talking about praying as part of your dating life. But at some point, when you've kind of crossed that threshold towards serious relationship, just introduce the idea, should we consider praying together? And then, see where that goes and see if there's a compatibility there. Okay, on to the next topic. I am moving way too slow. United as one. The idea that two become one flesh, as talked about here. The love of the spouses requires, of its very nature, the unity in indissolubility of the spouses' community of persons. That's the idea that they're united, which embraces their entire life. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. The unity of marriage, distinctly recognized by our Lord, is made clear in the equal personal dignity which must be accorded to man and wife in mutual and unreserved affection. So, the two become one is very important. And one means a lot of different things. It means, obviously, you're still separate people. Obviously, you'll still have some separate interests. but that between the two of you, in general, you have one common purpose and one common set of things. Big question I always put out there. Some groups that get it right away, but there are definitely plenty of groups that struggle with it, and it boggles my mind. Quiz question. What is the most obvious and visible way married couples become one flesh? Children. Children. Quite literally, the process of making a child is taking one's DNA, the fundamental thing that defines them physically, splitting it in half, and taking one half of it and taking a person of the opposite sex who does the same thing. They split their DNA in half, and you take one half of this person's DNA and one half of this person's DNA, and you stick them together, and you have a new set of DNA that is your child's DNA. You quite literally become one flesh in each of your children. Each one of your children is a different makeup of half of you and half of your spouse. For me, we too often forget about children in marriage. And for me, this is one where it shows how the theology is really, even with modern science involved, ordered towards children. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. Okay, some practical advice. Switching off your household responsibility, particularly over long periods of time. This is one that was actually, I appreciated more after I got laid off from my job, and I decided to start my own little small business, which was going to take a while to generate some money. In fact, it's still taking a while, and my wife went back to working full-time as a teacher. And now, all of a sudden, the person who had more free time to do things like grocery shopping and laundry and these sorts of things was me. I was the one who was around the house all day, whereas when the children were little, she was a stay-at-home mom, and I went off and did the normal corporate thing. And so she was at home to do things like grocery shopping and laundry and all of that. So we just kind of switched a number of those roles, and as is appropriate. But what I realized was, when I started going grocery shopping, I now really understood what it means to go grocery shopping. Yes, before I abstractly understood the stresses and issues of grocery shopping and the financial pressures of keeping under the budget and making sure there was enough food and not missing things, but also not having too much food. I could abstractly understand those things, but until I started doing it every week, and the wear and tear of doing it every week started to wear on me, I didn't fully understand it. And so if we're going to be fully one with our spouses, we have to get to really understand what they're going through. And obviously there are limits to that. My wife is never going to understand what it means to be an engineer or a project manager at a big corporation because she doesn't have the training for that. It's unlikely I will ever learn what it means to be a teacher, particularly a Spanish teacher. So there obviously are limits to what we can get inside, but there are plenty of things in our life that we could choose to occasionally switch off so we better understand each other's things that they do and better empathize with them. The next one's a big one of huge importance, uniting your money. I am not a fan of separate checking accounts. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong. There are plenty of people who do it and do it well. But what separate checking accounts encourages is think about your money and my money. Joint checking accounts prevent you from thinking about things that way. You have one account. This is your account as a couple, same credit card, all of these things that you both use. It really emphasizes the our in money, not yours and mine. Wendy and I's paychecks have always come into the same account, and it really helps us think of it as our money. Now, there are reasons why people may not do that. I'm not saying everyone has to do it. Some people have issue with tracking their money, like they have trouble with bouncing checks, that sort of thing. That would be more of a reason to consider having separate accounts so that you can keep track of those things. We've always been very good about, relatively speaking, of tracking our money and knowing how much we have and knowing if we're risking spending all of it, and so that we didn't have to worry too much about, I go out and spend $400 on something, not realizing that I've just emptied the account out. So I'm not saying it works for everyone, but in a general sense, united money is really important, and joint checking accounts is a way to do that. There are others, though. Just making sure you sit down and make a budget for every year, every month, that you agree upon this is how we are going to spend our money this year, and that it's clear there is only so much money for Ken's backpacking habits, and there is only so much money for things that my wife wants to do, and et cetera, et cetera. Very important. And again, that's not to say that we can't have money that's spent on us, but it's just about the idea of we've sat down and say how much exists. There was a priest I knew. He talked about one of the questions he asked every couple that was in engagement preparation: how much money can the other person spend without consulting you? And he found it very terrifying almost how much most of them had never considered the question, and in many of them, significant arguments broke out because of it. It suggests how much there's this my money, your money, different perspectives on what's okay. Having a united front of knowing what that figure is. Like, I'd say in my house, it's about $100, right? That isn't specifically budgeted, right? If we've specifically budgeted, there's whatever, $1,000 for a new camera for the live stream setup, and I go buy that when it's specifically budgeted. When I find the time to do it, I don't have to, and I probably do, but I don't have to say so before I buy it. But if it's something that's not really planned, part is just in some larger budget bucket like MISC or entertainment or whatever, then yeah, about $100 is the limit on what would be okay before we'd have to do it. But that could be a very different number in a different family. So having that kind of thinking is really important. Along those same lines, just retraining your thinking. It's not my money, it's not her money, it's our money. And the same goes for your debts. Every dollar that comes in, every dollar that goes out is ours. Not mine, not hers, ours. I would also suggest that for the items you own, right? Don't have his and her tablets. Have 2 family tablets. Now, obviously, there are limits to that. We should all have our own cell phones. It's the number people want to get a hold of me at, as opposed to getting a hold of my wife. So there's definitely reasons why you can have some of your own, but more and more items of ours as opposed to mine is good. Along those lines, one of the worst male examples I hear is the man cave. This is a room just for me. What it suggests, it actually suggests a couple of things. It suggests, one, that the man feels like the rest of the house doesn't belong to him and he needs a space for him. And that, to some degree, suggests that at least in that man's views, he's not getting enough input. The rest of the house isn't ours, it's hers. And so the reaction he's having is the wrong reaction, which is to say, well, then I want a space for me. No, the right answer to that is to say, wait a minute, all of this is supposed to be ours. And so I don't have a man cave where I can go retreat. I have a whole home that is a shared us. And that will include a general thinking of my needs and her needs, all of the above. And then, of course, always praying together. Praying together for unity is a wonderful thing. Before marriage advice, I really want to encourage you to avoid being set in your ways. Never go into a marriage saying the expectations is that X, Y, and Z will happen. That he will get a job here, she will go do this, we will buy a house in Roseville, and that's required. That's bad. Things change. We need to be flexible. We need to be willing to be dynamic. And any mindset where there are requirements is bad. This is why it is, I think, harder in some cases for older people to get married. Younger people have trouble getting married because they're not mature enough. They haven't learned enough humility. and so they have their problems. But the problem of older people is they're too set in their ways. And so I would say, particularly to those of you who maybe are older getting married, and I mean by older, late 20s, 30s, and onward, is to be very clear about, in your own mind, I'm not talking to your spouse, in your own mind about where am I being too rigid, and praying about that and working on it. It's a really bad idea to get married in a context where there are a bunch of conditions on what's going to happen after we get married. No, you accept them for better or for worse, whatever that means. All right, one more, and I'm going to try to get this quickly because I'm way over time. Permanence theology, although this is so important. By its very nature, conjugal love requires the inviolable fidelity of the spouses. This is the consequence of the gift of themselves which they make to each other. Love seeks to be definitive. It cannot be an arrangement until further notice. The intimate union of marriage as a mutual giving of two persons and the good of children demand total fidelity from the spouses and require an unbreakable union between them. I'll talk more about the importance of this, but what's really being stated here is, and we're going to talk about the givingness of marriage after the break, but if marriage really is an act of giving ourselves to the other person, right, it's considered a bad thing to give something to someone and then yank it back at a later date, right? That's considered bad form. And so the same thing applies to marriage. If we're going to make a gift of ourselves to the other person, it has to be permanent. Otherwise, it's not a gift, it's a contract. And marriage is not a contract, it's a gift of oneself. The other half of this is it's only permanent within life. Here's a little thing from the Gospel of Mark. Teacher, Moses wrote for us, if someone's brother dies, leaving a wife but no child, his brother must take the wife and raise up descendants for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first married a woman and died, leaving no descendants. So the second married her and died, leaving no descendants. And the third likewise. And the 7 left no descendants. Last of all, the woman died. At the resurrection, whose wife will she be? For all 7 had been married to her. Jesus said to them, are you not misled because you do not know the Scriptures or the power of God? When they arise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. Marriage, and we'll talk more about this, is a human, earthly institution, and therefore does not transcend to the afterlife. Because in the afterlife, we all love everybody perfectly. Marriage is a way for us to come as close as possible to perfect love here on earth. And so it doesn't really apply in the afterlife. So it's only life permanent. You are in no way disrespecting a previous wife if your wife dies and you marry again. Why? Because you did honor your promises to love, to give completely of yourself until death do us part. And unfortunately, and I do mean that in the most profound sense, and unfortunately your wife died, and so when you're able to pick up the pieces and marry again, you are in no way being disrespectful of that. So marriage is life permanent, not permanent. The first thing I want to talk about in practical advice, and again, this is one that's going to make me go on too long, is that speaking of divorce or separation is extremely, notice the big font, extremely corrosive. When people are in a group of any sort where the idea is that the individuals are giving up something for the benefit of the group, the best way to get people to stop doing that is if they fear the breakdown of the group. And this is true for a business, this is true for a parish, this is true in any environment. It is a natural human reaction to say, look, I'm not going to keep giving to this if it's about to fall apart. And how much more profoundly true is that within a marriage? The moment things start to go sideways, the moment one spouse stops being willing to forgive the other, to give extra, to go above and beyond, is when people start fearing that divorce and separation are coming. Because they say, why am I going to keep putting into this if it's about to fall apart? Why would I waste those resources, right? Or I'll give you another example of just in the general sense. When a candidate has, for like president or an office or something, has a bad debate, afterwards the donations start drying up. And it's not just because people are thinking, well, I don't like them anymore. It's also because the people who like them are thinking, I don't think they're going to make it. And so why would I keep pumping money into something that is about to fall apart? So I really, really, really encourage every married person here, in particular, if it's come up in your marriage at any time, the idea of divorce or separation, to have a sit down and say, that was a huge mistake, it's corrosive to our relationship, and I am promising to you right now I will never bring it up again, and I ask that you join me in that pledge. You will be able to do so much more in improving and reconciling your marriage once you have gotten over that hump. Once you get to the place where you can say, I know both of us are in this for the rest of our lives. And another reason, and so that's the key, that's the foundation on which almost all the rest of this advice exists. Because once you've done that, you are now able to take the long view to problems. You can say, I don't have to solve this today or tomorrow or next week. I can wait for this to be solved for a year or 2 years. Because I'm going to be in this forever. And I'm okay with the idea that I'm taking it a little on the hard side right now, but there will be decades where the opposite will be true. It also ironically helps you to do the opposite, which is to keep working on solving it. If you have the mindset that this might fail, you might get to the point where you say, well, why should I keep working on it? And you may lose some urgency for working on it. One of the things I've noticed with both my wife and I is we come to the table to reconcile very quickly. And it comes from this mindset of, we know we're stuck with each other for the rest of our lives. So we have two choices when we had a bad day or a problem or whatever. We can either solve that problem and get back to being on the right footing and do it as soon as possible, or we can just extend the torture. Why would we want to do that? We know we're going to be in this forever. There's no reason to wait, outside of external forces. So let's get back on the same page, and let's do so quickly. So ironically, it works in both directions. This agreement to permanence both helps you be willing to take a long view to working on a problem, like maybe a big problem, like you're in a bunch of debt, or you have some legal problems or whatever. But on the other hand, when it's something that can be resolved quickly, you're doubly motivated to do so because all you're doing is delaying the pain by not working on it. Also, work on being flexible to each other's desires. Again, you can't have a lifelong commitment with a lot of conditions. It just doesn't work out well. The key to longevity is flexibility, and so be flexible. And then finally, really work on forgiving past failures. And I would suggest if you have something, a failure of your spouse that you're having a tough time forgiving, go to confession to confess that you're having a tough time forgiving. Because it's really important in a marriage that you're able to forgive, that you're able to say, mistakes were made, I've made mistakes, you've made mistakes, I'm willing to forgive your mistakes, you're willing to forgive mine. It's again one of those things that really helps get back to a good, productive marital relationship. So really work on forgiving them. It'll make it easier for them to forgive you when they see that you're willing to forgive. Forgiveness is one of those things that builds on itself. Other people forgiving helps a new people forgive, and this is definitely true within a marriage. So being willing to forgive, willing to say I'm sorry in the inverse, to ask for forgiveness, these are all wonderful things in a marriage, and permanence helps us do that. And if we're struggling with it, go to the confessional and admit that you're struggling with it. Because obviously there are some things that are difficult to forgive. But that doesn't mean we stop. It means we need to work even harder on finding a path to forgiveness. Before marriage advice, embrace this idea that it's a lifelong union and make sure you marry someone who believes it as much as you do. You want somebody who they really get. You're stuck with each other till the very end of one of your lives. And that, trust me, it'll make a huge difference, a huge positive difference if both of you really embrace that and recognize its importance. Okay, intermission, a full 20 minutes late. This is going to be a long one tonight, folks, so therefore we need a good intermission. Reminder, this is a good time to submit questions. I explained at the beginning, get logged into YouTube, use your Gmail account, your Google account, your YouTube account, get logged in, and then just write deacon question dash, and then the question immediately after that, all in one comment. If you don't have a YouTube account, you can go to deaconken.org/blog/chat, open chat session there to do the same thing. And yes, we need intermission. I've been talking for 50 minutes, which is way more than I should. So let's take a 2-minute break. Go ask your question first so it gets in our queue. Then go get a snack and meet us and a drink or something, and then meet us back here in 2 minutes. Okay. On to question and answers. In this case, looks like we had one mid-session that the team decided should wait for questions after intermission. So, and we have to make a judgment call on whether something is for intermission or is for right away. But so this was one that was asked earlier in the session. Go ahead, Peter.
How can same-sex marriages fulfill the one flesh aspect?
They cannot. The Catholic Church does not believe in same-sex marriages, even in a natural sense, right? So I've talked about this difference between the sacramental marriage and the natural marriage, and those are real things, but there are still certain things that define a marriage, and part of that is it is a union that is ordered towards man and woman creating new life. That's the fundamentals of marriage. So, a gay marriage, in the civil sense of things, although a legal arrangement that is recognized in our society, the Catholic Church does not recognize it as a marriage in the sense of fulfilling the definitions of marriage. And really, my talk about homosexuality will speak to this. And I think that's my next one up in 2 weeks. So definitely a lot to go over there. I wish I had more time, but I'm already way behind schedule. So if you have more follow-up questions on that one, definitely in 2 weeks we'll discuss it in great detail. But for the short answer is the church does not consider a gay marriage a marriage of any sort, natural or sacramental. We have another question, Peter? Are we good? All right, moving on. I'm going to do my best to go through this somewhat quickly, but I don't want to miss too many things, so let's keep going. Life of service. Again from the Catechism. Christ dwells with them, gives them strength to take up their crosses and so follow him, to rise again after they have fallen, to forgive one another, to bear one another's burdens, to be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ, and to love one another with supernatural, tender, and fruitful love. All of this suggests an idea of service, that this is not just a contractual thing, that we are doing these things out of loving service to one another. So through marriage, we are to serve Christ, and by extension, when we serve Christ, we are called to serve society. And we're called to serve one another, our spouses, and spouses to each other, and we're called to serve our children. All of these things come together in the sacramental mindset of marriage as a life of service. There are 2 sacraments of service. The first is holy orders, or becoming a cleric, which is a deacon, priest, or bishop. That is a life of service to the church. That the role of that person, that man, is to serve the church through that sacramental ministry. The other sacrament of service is marriage, and that we serve God through family, through our spouses, through our children. And anybody who's been married knows that to be a good spouse requires serving them, and to be a good husband, or mother or father, requires a mindset of service. And so the church really embraces this idea that marriage is not a life of pleasure, although obviously we believe that service gives us great joy, but marriage at its heart is a life of service. We are choosing when we get married to serve the other and to serve the children that result. So I've already said this, but practical advice, we really, really, really have to get away from this idea of marriage as a contract. Now, it is true that in secular society, that is what it is. It is a contract between a man and a woman, or in societal sense, it's a contract between any 2 people, because gay marriage allows for 2 men or 2 women to be married. And it is a contract that says, and actually some of these things are getting a little softer with time, but historically, you will only have sex with this person. You will unite your money with them, that your money is their money. That's why at the end of a marriage, when there's divorce, you have to settle up, so to speak. You have to say, how are we going to split this money? Because your money was united in marriage, right? And, a few other kind of contractual requirements that exist within marriage. And in a societal sense, that contract is breakable, right? One of you can decide, I want to break this contract and get out. That is not how the church looks at it. Even though it is true when we get married, we additionally have the societal contractual parts of it. The fundamentals of it is the godly sacramental part of it. And that is not a contract. It is a covenant. It is a life of service. And so the first thing I would say, never get into a place where you think, the arrangement of our marriage is I get X and she gets Y, and that is what joins us. That is how it works out. I get this, she gets that, and we're happy because each of us gets something we want. No, that's completely backwards. Instead, we should be thinking of, I love this person, I want them to have X, and I don't feel the need to get anything in return. I'm doing it out of love. The good news is the other person's thinking the same, and so you're able to, that you get the joys that go along with a mutual loving relationship. But you have to be motivated not by the fact of what you get in return, but you have to be motivated by love and not have the condition that goes along with that. You're going to give them what helps them the most because you love them, and that's it. Along this idea is one of the worst thing a lot of married people do, even if they don't use this terminology, is they keep points. The idea of keeping points is, I did something really good. Therefore, I have gathered some points. And I can put these points in a bank account, in a virtual account, the marital bank account, if you will, to someday make a withdrawal. That in a month when I need something, I can say to my spouse, you remember back when whatever, and I mowed the lawn even when I was exhausted. I think that means you need to repay me now with whatever. This is, again, a wrong way. It is a contractual way to look at marriage. Don't have points. Don't think that when you've done something good, it gives you the right to demand something later. That is not love. That is a contract. Love is giving. It is selfless. We mow the lawn when it's tough because we love our family, not because we're going to get something later. Servants get no points, right? They just serve. Really important. The other thing I would say that really helps the mindset of service is to turn outwards. When everything is focused inwards on the marriage, you tend to think of it in happiness terms of, my marriage is about us being happy. The most happy people are the people who are not obsessed with their own happiness. They're people who actually have some purpose outside themselves. And so by turning outward with your marriage, of seeing yourself as a united union where you go out to serve the world, united as one entity of service, you actually end up a lot more happy. You'll end up a lot more joyful. And it takes a lot of the pressure off of the ideas of, I deserve X because I did Y. No, you're both out doing something good for the world at large. In concept, children are the beginning and bedrock of this idea, but it's not limited to that at all. We can go far beyond that. And that's why you hear about these stories of families where the husband and wife stay married until the children grow up. And sometimes people will be too explicit about it. They'll say, well, we only stayed together because of the kids. I think that's always a harsh statement to say it that way. But the point of that is they were able to sustain the marriage because during that time they turned outward. And then when the children were gone, they were unsuccessful at finding something new to turn outward towards. They turned inward and they didn't like what they saw. And so generally speaking, it's easier to have a happy and productive marriage if you have an outward mindset, not being focused on whether the two of you are pleasing each other, but focused on whether the two of you are being good servants of Christ in this world. Okay. Before marriage advice. This is one of those things where the person either thinks this way, people do change. I don't want to be too harsh. But at a simple level, people who think in a service mindset are people who tend to stay that way. And people who are selfish, they can change. People have revolutions of thought in their mind, but it's something only they can do. It's something that you can't encourage them well, you can encourage, but it's something you can't make them do. And so you need to embrace that it's a life of service and make sure that the person you're marrying views it the same way. Be a service-oriented person in your single life. And then find someone who is too. You do that, you're going to be off to a great start. You get a Catholic who is service-minded, and you're a Catholic who's service-minded, and you get this idea where we are going to unite our purpose of service, and that children are likely to be a part of that. I think it's such a recipe for success. It's so much harder to fail. Yes, you might have difficulties and problems, but they're going to be so much easier to solve because you're outwardly focused. Your life permanence things allows you to work on things over time, and you're not going to give up easily. Now, we've been talking about giving. What is one of the great ways we give? By giving life. Marriage and the question about homosexuality brought this out. Marriage is a life-giving union. At the most simple level, at the most natural level, not even the sacramental, but the natural level, marriage is about children. Why is marriage connected to sex? That's a question a lot of people don't consider. Why is it that a marriage is a sexual union? Why is that what makes these two people join together? Why couldn't you just have two business associates, of totally, a 50-year-old man and a well, let's not do it that way. a 50-year-old lady and a 30-year-old guy who really have no physical attraction to each other, but have this great business relationship going. They say, let's get married. Why isn't that something? No. Marriage is always considered a sexual union. And what is the fundamental purpose of sex? At its root, it starts with creating children. And I know that that we again, this is another one of the things society tends to not want to think about, but at the root of it, the issue is that I need to hold a pause for just 1 second. I'm going to go on mute for just a second and go offline for just a sec. I'll be back in 10 seconds, and I'm going to go off camera. Okay, I apologize for the interruption there. A little bit of a technical issue I wanted to make sure I resolved. Okay, where was I? So let's read this paragraph and we'll continue from there. By its very nature, the institution of marriage and married love is ordered to the procreation and education of the offspring, and in them it finds its crowning glory. Marriage is about children. Sex is about children. This is something the church has recognized for thousands of years, and a big part of the reason society and the church are currently at odds about marriage is because society has decided to forget this. And we refuse to forget this just because society wants to. We'll continue. Children are the supreme gift of marriage and contribute greatly to the good of the parents themselves. God himself said, "It is not good that man should be alone." And from the beginning he made them male and female, wishing to associate them in a special way by his own creative work. God blessed them, man and woman, with the words, "Be fruitful and multiply." Hence, true married love and the whole structures of family life which result from it are directed to disposing the spouses to cooperate valiantly with the love of the Creator and Savior, who through them will increase and enrich his family from day to day. So, practical advice, and I'm going to get on my rant here. We really So one of the biggest problems that this issue of society freeing marriage from being about children and freeing sex from being about children is it allows us to turn sex into a lustful thing because it is no longer about its main purpose, procreation. Now, you have to be really careful here, and I probably should have another session trying to understand this whole idea of sex and being associated with procreation, because it's not the only thing. Sex is two things. It's procreative and unitive. And the church says both of them are important, but they are not separable. You cannot have one without the other, right? And you can think of the unitive in simplest terms as the pleasurable aspect of it. But lust happens when we rip those two things apart. Rip apart the unitive and the procreative, and we put the pleasurable alone by itself. And that's where lust comes from. And in our current era, where marriage has been, in many ways, stripped of being about children, and where sex has been stripped from being about children, lust is running rampant, and it's running rampant even within marriages. There are lots of people who think that because they're married, that their sex cannot be lustful. That is absolutely not true. It is just as possible for sex inside marriage to be lustful as outside of it. Here's the difference. Lustful sex is sex where the primary aim is self-gratification. It's about, I'm having this act because I want to be pleasured. That's the goal. Now, you can argue that there are sexual relationships where that is the goal, and both people are happy about it because both people are getting that. The man's getting it, the woman's getting it. It's a contractually wonderful sexual thing because they're both getting the pleasure that they desire. That is the way that modern secular world looks at sex. But the church says this is not sufficient because it is not about giving, is it? It's not about selfless, it's about selfish. And the fact that for the moment that those sexual interactions are pleasurable and wonderful is fleeting, and it's not going to last. Love is exactly the opposite. It is selfless. It is giving. It is not concerned with the self-pleasure. It is concerned with the other. It is concerned what you're giving to the other. And so sex in a fruitful marital environment is so much more powerful and wonderful because it is not about the personal. So, it's very important. If you've noticed yourself viewing sex in that first way, that it is about the two of us each getting pleasure for ourselves, pleasuring each other, but in this mindset of the goal is I get it, you get it, we're both happy, it's time to find a way to change that. And I don't know, it's difficult to make that change because it's so comprehensive. But I think it's necessary. If you really want to get to a selfless marriage, a giving marriage, sex is a very, very important place for this to change. Along with this, I think the idea of being open to numerous children. Everybody has to deal with their own issues of their family and how to work things out, but the church is right when it sees sex as being tied to procreation, and therefore, if you're having a fruitful sexual relationship, in most cases that will result in a number of children. The reality is, children are our greatest blessing. This is the way the church looks at it. They're a blessing, not a burden. If you think about the way society looks at it, they're a limited blessing that could definitely be a burden, and so we need to limit the number because we want to find the maximum relationship between getting the blessing that they are and not overdoing the burden. No, they're a blessing, full stop. We need to be really wary of the thoughts of we couldn't handle more children. I know very, very few people who are elderly who say, I wish I hadn't have had my last child. That they could look little Bobby in the eye and say, yeah, it would have been better if you weren't born. Of course not. But I know tons of elderly people who regret that they only had 2 children, who look back and say that that was a mistake. So God gives, now there are limits. I don't want to be too definitive here, but God gives us the grace. God gives us what we need to survive. Yes, there might be some sacrifices. Yes, not all of them will get to go to Yale, but that's okay. You're bringing another wonderful life into the world. You're more likely to handle it than you think. Another piece I want to touch on, I'm going to touch on very briefly. I want you to see in your children your own weaknesses and your spouse's weaknesses. You probably do this already. It's not hard. But then I want you to learn how to be, and for me this is very easy. For other people, I think it's a little bit of a challenge. But learn how to love your spouse's weaknesses through your children's weaknesses. I'll give you one from our family that has very much changed. When it comes to motion sickness, I am a rock. Trust me. I go sailing out on the ocean in small boats, or at least I used to. Life has kind of changed a bit. And I'm the guy they would send underneath into the moldy part of the boat to get the new sail or fold up the other sail or do that. And nobody else wanted to do it, and I always got to do it. I'm that guy, the guy you can send in the toughest motion sickness environment, and I'm probably not going to have any problem with it. My wife, not so much. She's on the, I wouldn't say she's unusual, but more on the lines of struggling with motion sickness like lots of people do. All of my children have that. The number of times we've had to pull over on a windy road while one of our children vomited has been significant. We've put little things in the side of in the little place where we have drinks and stuff, or the sidewalls of the doors in all of our cars so that they can very quickly get this medical-grade barf bag. And it has saved our upholstery in our car numerous times. Early in the marriage, this was very difficult for me. It angered me that my children were like this. And looking back, I always had disdain for people like that. How wimpy and weak are you is the way I would look at them. Just toughen up your gut. You can do it. Look at the horizon. Get over your seasickness. Is what's your problem? That was where my head was. I am 20 times, if not 100 times, more sympathetic to everyone, and particularly to my wife, now that I have had to watch my children, who my love for is so much more instinctual, struggle with this. Seeing my wife's weaknesses in my children has made it easier for me to love and appreciate my wife having that weakness. I think it's and there are other examples. It's a wonderful way for us to become more sympathetic to weaknesses that we have, because we all have them. And I think it's just a very good thing to do. I'd love to go on, but I'm way over time. See service of children as part of the life-giving nature. Make sure you see this. You're serving your children. You've decided to have a life of service, and this is part of it. Being life-giving is part of service. And then I do want to touch very briefly on the inverse. For those of you struggling with infertility issues, everything I said can be very frustrating, right? It's like, I've wanted to have children. I've wanted to give service this way. I've wanted to be able to do these things. And Deacon Ken, you're telling me, or this is how people will react, that my marriage isn't complete. My marriage is missing out on these things. And the important thing to say is you've done everything God wants you to do by being open to life. You're not disappointing God by doing this, or by not having children. Let me be more clear. God has decided, for whatever reason, that at least at this time, or up until now, He doesn't want you to have children. So you are not in any way disappointing God, and you are no way reneging on your promises as a spouse. You are doing everything you're supposed to by being open to life. So don't be hard on yourself. Don't. I know it can be very easy to see this talk of the importance of the life-giving, all this. You're doing everything you can, full stop. Be charitable. But what you can do to help yourself in this space is recognize that you can be parent-like in so many different ways. There's so many different ways you can use service to children who may not be your own to do the same thing. Obviously, at the top of that list is adoption, and every couple has to decide whether that's right for them, and for many couples it's not right. But at the simplest level, that's one way you can have children without having children. And God knows there are tons of children out there who need adopting, and to put a fine point on it, particularly minority children. If you look at the adoption world out there, it's much more expensive to get a white baby who hasn't had any drug histories in its background than it is to get a black or Latino child. Why? Because what's in demand. So if you choose to adopt, I'd like to encourage you to consider adopting minority children, even if you're white. And I know that that's a little hard. It makes it more obvious that you've adopted, and there's other things that go along that. But if you're viewing this as a life of service, and you're viewing adoption as a form of life-giving service, then that's a wonderful way to do it, isn't it? You're showing that it really is about service and a good thing to do. But there's tons of things beyond adoption. Coach a kid's soccer team. Volunteer to work with the kids here at church. Maybe you're an aunt or an uncle, and you can help your brother or sister who's having children by being a good aunt or uncle in their family. So you can embrace the life-giving nature of marriage and children, even if God has not granted you the gift of children yourself. You've done nothing wrong. I want that to be abundantly clear. But if you're really feeling that yearning, you're really wanting to be able to do that, to have the graces that go along with service of children, find ways to do it through other children. All right, before marriage advice. Living chastely, right? Don't live together ahead of time. Do your best not to have sex ahead of time. This one of the wonderful ways to prove that marriage is about children and that marriage is about sex is to save sex for marriage. It really helps prove the point that sex is a very powerful act. It's an act that can create a child, and you shouldn't be doing that act until you're married and have the wherewithal to be able to have children. Similarly, don't get married until you're ready to have children, right? If you're in a place in your life where you need to finish up college and do those sorts of things, you might want to consider waiting till you graduate or something like that. Or at least to figure out how you're going to deal with the possibility of a child 9 months after you get married. There are ways that can be done while you're still in college or you're still in some training program or whatnot. I'm not saying it can't be done, but if you look at that and you can't figure out how it can be done, then maybe you should wait until after those things happen before you get married. Treat marriage as the moment you might start having children. And then be open to the possibility that you may not be fertile, right? Or that your spouse may not be fertile, and never hold that against them if that's true. Figure out how to handle that gracefully. Go into marriage that, yes, you're likely to have children, but it is not foundational to your marriage. That what is foundational is openness to children, not that you actually have them. Okay, so we're going to change gears here. Everything up till now was very much based on the theology of the church. But as I said, sacramental marriage is natural marriage plus an additional layer of graces. So that means things that would apply to natural marriages also apply to our sacramental marriages, because it is a natural marriage with more built on top of it. So let's talk through some practical advice that really at its fundamentals is about natural marriage. If you go and you look, on various studies that have been done, what the causes of divorce are, or the things that stress marriages to their breaking point, here's a top order list of the main things that cause marital problems. Economic strife, low educational status, substance abuse, or large differences in age, culture, education, or family wealth. Now, just as a quick aside, I remember how I talked about how there are these historic ideas of you only marry in your same religion, you only marry in your same race, you only marry in your same culture, you only marry in your same income bracket, all of these things. And while some of these definitely were bigoted, like race, I actually think some of them had a certain wisdom to them, and modern marriage has proved it. Because look at how many of these things are the things that 100 years ago you weren't supposed to marry outside of. You weren't supposed to marry outside of culture or educational status or family wealth, right? And we're seeing in modern marriage, as we're breaking those old guidelines, that they're causing strife within marriage. Maybe not insurmountable. Maybe we should learn how to be more open, that if we embraced a lot of these other things about marriage, some of these things wouldn't matter as much. But let's not pretend that in a natural marriage they don't matter. So, these are the things that tend to cause divorce or stress marriages. So let's talk. Now, some of these, there's not a ton you can do about, but at least from a Catholic perspective. But let's talk about the ones that you can, in particular, economic issues. The one thing I want to suggest to all of you who are married, well, frankly, to everybody, but particularly to married couples, if you want to take a lot of stress away from your marriage, is figure out how to get out of debt ASAP. The couples that struggle the most are not just the ones who are living on a small amount of money. It's those who have huge amounts of debt that exceed their ability to pay it off. Debt is a form of slavery. You are a slave to the bank that you owe money to. And that's just no good. Slavery is bad. I don't think we have to convince ourselves of that. What we've had trouble with is because slavery in the United States was so tied to racial slavery and what we call chattel slavery, we've forgotten that there are other forms, other ways that you can be enslaved. And money is definitely one of them. So getting out of debt removes this version of slavery in your life. A good way to define debt is if the amount you owe on all of your assets, or amount you owe in general, is more than what you could pay for if you sold all of your assets and any cash you had on hand. Because then you're not in debt, right? Let's say you own a $500,000 home, but you only owe $200,000. If tomorrow you decide you want to move to Bora Bora, you can sell the home, pocket the $300,000, and you're fine. Some people would look at that at $200,000 of debt and say it's a problem. But because it's tied to an asset that's worth so more, at any moment you can choose to free yourself of that debt. But let's say you own a home that's worth $500,000 and you get a mortgage for $490,000. And then the real estate market goes down even 5%. Now all of a sudden you owe more than the home is worth. You can't get out of there without declaring bankruptcy or going through some nasty process. Now you are enslaved. And if you think about the forms of debt out there that enslave the most, they're credit card debt, they're medical debt, they're debts that do not have an asset attached to them. So I would say do everything in your power not to have any debt that isn't attached to an asset, and that whatever debt you have that is attached to that asset is always significantly less than that asset is worth now and will be worth into the future. That way, anytime you want to get out of it, you can get out of it like that. It may require a life change you're not happy with. Selling that $500,000 house may not be what you want, but at least you could. And that's very important, and I think it's very important in a marital situation, because now if between the two of you say, we just need to do something else, you can. But if you in a marital situation you say, we need to do something else, and the answer is, we can't. We're shackled to this house. We're shackled to our cars that are worth $30,000 less than what our current car payment on them, or our car loan on them is. That's hard because you know the answer. You know what you need to do with your life to make your marriage better, but you can't because the money is stopping you. So get out of debt. If you want to help your marriage, get out of debt. One of the great blessings is Wendy and I both have very much believed this from the beginning. When I was laid off, we had money in the bank. The only loan we had was our home, and it was worth significant. The loan was significantly less than even at the bottom of the housing reception than the house was worth. It gave us great freedom to do what we needed to do. Another one I would say is, this is particularly before you have children, but I think it applies even after you have children, and maybe children are out of college or whatever. Try to live on just one of the incomes, hopefully the smaller of the two incomes. Because again, it gives you so much more freedom. If someone wants to quit their job, they're not happy with their boss, you can. You can live on that one income. And the great news is then you're going to have a bunch of spending money for trips to Hawaii or whatever you want to do, or maybe doing great, good charitable works with, since we see marriage as a life of service. But it, again, gives us so much more freedom. If one of us gets laid off, you can survive it. Money might be really tight, but you can survive it. So trying to live on one income is a really, really good thing. And it's not bad to have the extra money. You can do great and wonderful things with it, both personal enjoyment and charitable, but it's available to do that. One of the biggest ways people make a mistake here is they buy too big of a house. The classic blunder, and I've seen this, I personally know of at least a dozen cases of this. Educated couple gets out of college, both have a good professional salary, they go buy a home commensurate to two professional salaries, and then, as is normal in most marriages, they have a child. Now they have to make a tough choice. Either both of them have to keep working, or they have to sell the house and downsize. And we all know how hard that is to do. And, for a lot of people, they say, well, we wanted to keep working. It's okay. And, for them, good for them. It works out. But a lot of women think that's what they want. But when they get into having the child and the stresses on their body and a very tight emotional bond that they don't want to have to leave that child at daycare, well, they've got no choice. They've got bills to pay. A mortgage has to be paid. And they're not interested in downsizing. They're too connected to this house. It's a huge endeavor to move. And so they feel very forced to work. They cannot make the decision. Again, a personal example. We did well. We purposely bought a house that our budget was set up around just my income. And we were both working, making a fair amount. And then we had Gregory, and Wendy said she wanted to go back to work, and she went half-time. And then she realized this wasn't what she wanted anymore. And so then it was like, fine. Money was a bit tight after that, and we had more children, and she stayed at home. That worked out really well, and we had the flexibility to do that because we bought the small house in our neighborhood, not the big house. So I really, really think through particularly your big investments in a home and something, and what would you do if you were down to one income? Before marriage advice. Understanding the practical challenges of marrying someone who's very different from you is, I think, really important. If you are going to marry outside your cultural, outside your economic circles, really get to understand what that means. Really understand the impacts of that. Make sure it is somebody that you can overcome those things, and do so without the googly eye love thing. Do it very pragmatically. What's it going to be like, let's say you're a white person marrying a Latino, and a Latino has, there's a lot of cultural ideas, not that there aren't in the white culture, they are there, but they're of a different nature. And then all of a sudden, the Latino family and all of that says, well, why aren't you doing X? Why aren't you doing Y? And the Latino child is like, well, yeah, we're going to get to that. And you're thinking, I didn't realize that's what we were up against. I didn't understand these cultural pieces. and it can create strife in a marriage. So what I encourage you to do is, if you're going to marry someone outside of culture, economic, um, uh, educational stratus that you're used to, you better get to really understand those things and understand that you're going to have to embrace those differences and make them and adjust to them. And you don't necessarily have to have it all figured out ahead of time. You just have to know that there's going to be some significant differences in your life that are going to reflect those differences in mindset that come from being in a different demographic group. Be very aware of that. Those things are more overcomable than the religious piece, because the religious piece are your fundamental truths, and these are more outside of that, although very important to many people, but it still has the same sort of impact. Next up, avoid someone with indicators of substance abuse. Very, very hard to have a marriage where one or both have substance abuse problems. Struggles for a lot of people, and I know sometimes you don't realize these things till after marriage, but be very wary of that. And then finally, be very realistic about economic needs. Be very honest about any debts you have, and insist on honesty from your future spouse about the same. You want to go into a marriage knowing how much debt exists between the two of you, if any at all. And this is critical, if you meet someone, you find out they've got $200,000 in college debt, you have to accept that the day you get married, you have $200,000 in college debt. It is just as much your debt as theirs. It's not this burden that they have placed on you. It's a burden you have shared together that is just as much yours as theirs. And depending on the person, you may not be willing to accept that. And if so, maybe this isn't the right person for you, or maybe it's not the right person until they've paid it off. But don't enter the marriage with the expectation that's a problem they have to solve and it's not your problem. The instant you get married, you have adopted their financial problems and they are yours for life. And be very clear and realistic about that. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. I have family members who did that, and they've done exactly what they should. It became their problem, and they're helping to get out of debt. It was college debt, helping to ensure that they get out of that college debt. I think they're mostly done at this point, actually. It's been about a decade, I think. But nevertheless, they really did the right thing of embracing it. And it was a little hard for them at first, but they did the right thing. So I'm not saying you can't do it. In fact, it might be the most loving thing you could do, to say, I love you so much that I'm going to get into this marriage, even though I know I'm taking on this burden that's a tough one to take on. So it actually can be a very life-giving, life of service mindset. So I'm not saying don't do it, but you just need to be willing to recognize it's what you're doing and be all in on doing it. Okay, I threw a ton of things at you in, holy smokes, an hour and 40 minutes. I am way over tonight. Go through the things, excuse me, the conclusion stuff really, really quickly. Get your final questions in right now, any of you who are left. Same thing on YouTube, logged in, Deacon Question, all capitals. If you don't, deaconken.org/blog/chat. Start the comment with Deacon Question dash all capitals. Get those in right now, because at the end of the conclusion, if I haven't had any questions, we'll end right away. Okay, conclusion. Marriage is a great blessing. It is a wonderful blessing, but it also takes a lot of work. But if we embrace all of these aspects of work as a life of service, and that service is a gift to ourselves, it can be good and wonderful work. To quote one of my favorite musicians, it's good work if you can get it. Okay, on to the satisfaction survey. I want to give you an example from this last week. I got one of my survey results and left their email, said that I should repeat the question after it was asked. And so I reached out to them and said, I have a person who asks the question, is there something going wrong? And he said, yeah, I can't hear them. So I went and looked back at the video, and sure enough, it wasn't quite loud enough. So we've emphasized this week on being louder and being more clear. So giving me this good feedback helps me improve. So please take the survey. Please be clear, even about the most trivial of downsides, to let me know, because I will work on them, I promise, and make the sessions better. So you do it by going to deaconken.org/blog. It's been live for over 40 minutes now. Go take it right now before you forget. And if you're watching this later, you're watching this tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now, still interested in that feedback, you may, if I've had more sessions in between now and then, you may have to search down through the blog list to find it, and that's where this longer link might help you. But you can always put in a survey result much longer after the fact. Next time, next week is one of the 2 breaks I'm taking this summer, so we won't have one next Thursday. We'll have one in 2 weeks. And as I said, the topic is, what does the church teach about homosexuality? So we'll get into all of those things about gay marriage and what this all means and what the church thinks. I know without the context, it can seem like the church is being very hateful. My promise to you is I'll do everything in my power to show you how actually the church is very loving towards gay people. It's just loving in a way that is not indulgent to a certain set of behaviors. So I know that sounds impossible, and that's why you need to turn it in 2 weeks if you think that way, and I'll do my best to explain how it's true. Here's the full list. We're actually getting to the end. We only have 2 more sessions left. And then we'll start a monthly series in September, always looking for topics. Use the feedback, the satisfaction survey, the bottom questions, anything else you want to add, give me topics. I've gotten 2 or 3 new ones for next year based on that. Additional information, same links as always, deaconken.org. You can find it within there. It's not hard. If you want to email me, ken@deaconken.org. Finally, subscribing. We got a couple new subscribers in the last week. Awesome stuff. I really would love to get those last 16 so I can get a named YouTube channel. So, sign up for a couple more Gmail accounts. Use them to log into YouTube and subscribe to my channel. Get me over the hump. If I have any new viewers tonight, please, 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 over on YouTube, be logged in and subscribe to my channel. It's not just for publicity. It is so that I can get certain features on YouTube, and in particular, as a named URL, you can get that at 100 users. But then things like embedding live streams on my website or the parish website, I need to get all the way to 1,000. I know that's a long ways away, but once it starts building up, then they will start posting my video on the main page of people who have similar interests, and that hopefully will net additional subscribers. So please subscribe. It is important. I hate that it's important. I hate that I have to ask, but it is what it is. Okay, on to questions. Peter, what do we have tonight? We've got nothing. We just had the 2 questions early, which is fine. We are way over time, so we're going to wrap it up on this very, very long YouTube session with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you for being with us this evening and for the blessings of our marriages. Hopefully this session will have been an opportunity for us to reflect on the gifts that have been our marriage and on the ways we can improve them. Help us to use prayer to be a vehicle for improving our marriages and so go closer to you. And we ask this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. God bless you all. Hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and see you in a couple weeks for Faithful Questions.